Hi, everybody. We are going to start talking about individuals with disabilities and victimization. So, individuals who have disabilities are at far greater risk for victimization than individuals who don't, and that's based off of the vulnerability that their disability status affords them. Disabilities are long lasting, and therefore they interfere with a lot of areas of function, such as self care, language, learning, mobility, and ultimately the ability to live independently. Individuals who have disabilities are victimized at a much greater rate than those who do not. So, out of every 1,000 people who are disabled, 33 of them will be victims. And that's going to be compared to out of the non disabled population, only 22 out of every 1,000 individuals will end up being victimized. Physical disability, there's two types. There's physical disability, there's developmental disability. A physical disability is going to be a physical limitation that precludes someone from being able to take care of themselves and to engage in physical activities like walking, getting dressed, bathing themselves, climbing stairs, doing day-to-day tasks. Developmental disabilities, on the other hand, are going to be disabilities that are rooted in cognitive function or cognitive dysfunction or neurological dysfunction. So things like autism, cerebral palsy, intellectual disabilities, learning disabilities, etc., would fall under the category of developmental disabilities. Within the population of disabled individuals, women and men are equally as likely to be victimized by violence, which is a deviation from all our other categories of violent crime. Typically, men are more likely to be victims of violent crime, but when there's a disability involved in the victim, it's an equal playing field where gender is concerned. Women who have disabilities who rely on in-care home care aides that they can't live independently, there has to be somebody there to do tasks for them, are actually at greater risk of being victimized by those who are not requiring that in-home care. They are more likely to be victimized physically and financially. So money is stolen by the caretakers, checks are forged, physical and sexual abuse by the caretakers occur, and neglect occurs. Women who have intellectual disabilities are 4 times more likely to be sexually victimized than women in the general population. If you think about that, that is a really staggeringly high proportion of victimization because women in general are at much greater likelihood of sexual victimization, but women who are disabled have, unfortunately, that compounding effect, and it makes them very, very vulnerable. Women who have disabilities are also 40% more likely to suffer from intimate partner abuse than women who do not have disabilities. And children with disabilities are at much greater likelihood of being abused than children who do not have disabilities. They're also 4 times more likely, children are 4 times more likely to be sexually abused when they're disabled versus when they are not. In addition, individuals with disabilities who are victimized are less likely to be victimized by people with weapons because of their vulnerable status. There's less need for weapons. In terms of explanation as to why this victimology happens among this group of people, routine activities theory has a really strong explanatory ability to explain excuse me, why this group of people is at such higher rate of being victimized. And part of it is because of those routine activities that there is going to be a lack of guardianship when they're vulnerable, right? That they can't take part actively in their own guardianship. So there's that lack of guardianship. And they're a suitable target because of that vulnerability. So the marriage of those elements of routine activities theory really comes together frequently among the disabled population. Let's talk about risk factors of victimization. So access is a big risk factor, which is where that intimate partner violence comes in, right? The person who's living with them has access to an incredibly vulnerable person. They have constant access to them physically and financially. Individuals with intellectual or developmental disabilities may not understand that they're being victimized, which results in more common victimization. Those with disabilities are also more likely to live in poverty, given their limitations on their ability to work. And we know poverty is related to all sorts of victimization. And then, of course, there's that caregiver fatigue and the stress that is involved in taking care of a disabled person, which also increases their likelihood of victimization. Let's switch gears and talk about the victimization of the mentally ill. So those with a mental health diagnosis are more likely to be victimized than those who do not have one. They're more likely to be homeless. They're less likely to hold consistent employment, which both increases their likelihood of falling to victims. Um, and also, here in the United States, we have a mental health crisis. We don't have adequate treatment to extend to these individuals, which makes getting out of their constant unmedicated, untreated circumstance even more difficult, which heightens their victimization risk. And finally, another special population of victims is going to be inmates, people who are incarcerated. Why? Because they're not free to leave their environment and they're at the behest of other people who are in charge of them. So it makes them very vulnerable. They have a lack of status and a lack of power in their living situation. And they also happen to live in places where there's concentrated physical violence. So they're at much greater risk of victimization from their fellow inmates, but also from the staff who oversee them. Female inmates who are overseen by male correctional officers are at much increased risk of sexual assault. But male on male rape is also a huge problem in male prisons and by both inmates and the correctional staff. It comes from both populations. Male minorities are at greater risk of being violently physically assaulted by correctional officer staff. And the mentally ill who are incarcerated. Unfortunately, let me give you this caveat. The biggest provider of mental health care in the United States is our Department of Corrections, unfortunately, because we don't have anywhere else to send the mentally ill. So we have a massive concentrated population of inmates who are mentally ill. So right there we have two huge risk factors, two special populations concentrated into one individual, which is really going to increase their likelihood of victimization. They're victimized at the hands of other inmates who see their vulnerability and take advantage of them. And they just simply don't get adequate treatment in prison, which leaves them unable to take care of themselves and protect themselves. Homosexual inmates are also at increase for falling victim to sexual assaults in prison from both staff and fellow inmates. And also juvenile offenders who are in secure detention facilities. Now, they're not considered inmates because it's a different system, but their freedom has still been revoked. They're not free to leave, and they have a complete and utter lack of power based on the fact that they are in a secure facility overseen by staff, and also they're legal minors, and they're very limited as to what rights and freedoms that they have on that basis, which puts them at tremendous vulnerability in these secure detention facilities. I'm sorry to say that they are at tremendous risk of physical and sexual assault, both from other juveniles who are in the facility and also staff who oversee them. One way to control sexual victimization in the inmate population is going to be putting individuals in isolation where they are, just not physically accessible by other people. However, this is a very unsuccessful way of preventing sexual victimization. It's really successful while they're in isolation, but human beings are social creatures, and we see mental health start to deteriorate very rapidly when people are put into isolation. So oftentimes people who are put into isolation for their own safety are very quick to turn around and say, please let me out. I can't stand being in here all by myself with no human stimulation constantly. So it's a very difficult population. Inmates, it's a very, very difficult population to protect them from sexual violence.